Welcome back. Today we're going to be starting Unit 3, and we're going to be starting Unit 3 by talking about conversions. So let's go ahead and get started with that right now. So here we are, it says converting fractions, decimals, and percents. It says let's rewrite them as equivalent fractions with the denominator of 100, and we'll convert them to equivalent fractions into decimals and percents from there. So we're going to start by turning each of these things into something out of 100, and that'll make it easy to make it a decimal because we can put it in the hundreds place, and it'll make it easy to make it a percent because it's out of 100. So let's start with 9/25. So I know that 25ths times 4, so 25 times 4 gives me 100. So I'm going to just do 9 times 4 to give me the top, and 9 times 4 is 36. So that's easy enough. I've got 36 100ths. So I can easily turn that into a decimal because I know I have 36 100ths. So I'm going to put the 36 in the hundredths place. And then that can easily be converted to know that 36 out of 100 is going to be 36%. So that's an easy way to convert something from a fraction to a decimal to a percent, is to take it to 100. And I could just figure out what the denominator is to get to 100, and then I can multiply the numerator by the same thing, and I can go across all the way. So let's try it again with the second one. So the second one, I've got 11 out of 20. So again, I'm going to figure out how do I get from 20 to 100. And I know that if I multiply 20 by 5, then I know that I'm going to get to 100. So 20 times 5 is 100. So I'm going to do the same things to 11. So 11 times 5 is going to give me 55. So I know it's going to be 55 out of 100. Let's make that a percentage, or let's make that a decimal. So 55 hundredths or 55 hundredths. With the 55 in the hundredths place. So now I know that 55 out of 100 is going to be a 55%. So again, I was able to convert fraction, decimal, percent very easily by figuring out what they go into by 100. So that is one way we convert. Let's do the same thing with 7 and out of 10. So how do I get from 10 to 100? So I'm going to multiply that by 10. 10 times 10 is 100. So 7 times 10 is going to be 70. So I know I'm going to have 70 out of 100. Move my decimal place, or not yet. I know that 70 is in the 70 100ths. You can also leave that as 0.7. You don't have to write the 0, but just so that we can see where it came from, we're going to write the 70. And then that is going to be 70%. 70 out of 100 is 70 out of 100 is 70%. Now I'm back down here to example D, where I'm out of 20ths again. So again, I know that's multiplying by 5 to get to 100. 1 times 5 is 5. So I know I'm going to have 5 out of 100. Now I'm going to write that 5 in the hundredths place, so I will have a 0 there in my tenths place because I only have 5, so 5 in the hundredths place, and I know that a 5 out of 100 is a 5%, which is not a whole lot out of 100, but I know that it is 5%. So let's take a look here at the last one, which is 3/8. So I'm going to just figure out what 8 into 100 is, and that's not going to go in evenly. So we're going to have to figure out another way to convert 3/8 because 8 times a number doesn't work out to 100 without using some sort of decimal. So we're going to need another way to do this. And let's look at that other way now. So here we are again with our fraction 3/8, and we're going to be converting any fraction to a decimal and percent. So when we first were looking at our fractions there, they only worked if we could multiply it to 100 to get ourselves to a decimal and percent. Now we're going to learn a way that will let us take any fraction to a decimal and percent. So the fraction we've chosen is 3/8 because that's the one we were stuck with on our little chart over there. So we're going to have to start by turning it to a decimal. And the way to do that is we're going to divide the numerator, or the top. If you're not sure what that is, you can write top in your notes. They're your notes, so feel free to write whatever will help you, by the denominator. So we're going to divide the numerator by the denominator. And unfortunately for us, since our calculator is still on the shelf, the only way to do that is long division. So let's go ahead and get into it now. I know it's not the most fun thing to do, but it has to be done in order to take our fraction to a decimal. So since I will be dividing the numerator by the denominator, I know the denominator is going to be on the outside of my long division problem, and the numerator is going to be on the inside of my long division problem. So I know 8 doesn't go into 3, so I know automatically I'm going to be starting with a decimal. And I can put a 0 there because I know that 8 goes into 3 0 times. So I'm going to bring down a 0 over here. 8 goes into 33 times, so I'm going to put a 3. 3 times 8 is 24. Bring over my 24, and then I'm going to have to do some subtraction. 30 minus 24 is 6. Now I know 8 doesn't go into 6, so I'm going to have to bring down another 0, and I've got 60. 8 goes into 60 7 times, so I'm going to write a 7. 7 times 8 is 56. Bring down my 56. Then I'm going to have 60 minus 56 is 4. So I'm going to bring down my 4. 8 doesn't go directly into 4, so I'm going to need another 0, bring it down. And 8 does go into 40 exactly 5 times. So 5 times 8 is 40. 40 minus 40 is 0. So notice that it came out, and I've got the decimal 3.75. So I was able to turn my fraction to a decimal. I didn't have to multiply out to 100. I know we had to use long division, and we're not big fans of that, but it was the only way that we could get this done. So now we need to move our decimal to a percent. Luckily for us, that's significantly easier than doing long division. So to get to a decimal to a percent, we're going to multiply that decimal by 100. That's one way to do it. That is the mathematical way to do it. However, there's a little bit of a cheat or a little bit of a secret that we can do it as well. This means to move the decimal 2 places to the right. So if we are able to remember to move our decimal 2 places to the right, then we can easily take our percent to, or a decimal to a percent without having to do any multiplication. So let's try that now. I know my decimal from before is 0.375. So I'm going to write my decimal. Then I'm going to move my decimal place 2 places to the right. 1, 2, as it told me to do. So now I know my percent is 37.5%. Excellent. So I was able to turn my decimal into a percent. I know that was much easier than turning my fraction to a decimal, but sometimes it is what it is. Now we have something that's important to remember here. In order to convert a fraction to a percent, we need to convert it to a decimal first. There is no way to go straight from fraction to percent. So if something says, hey, I go from a fraction to a percent, you have to go to a decimal first. There is no other way to do it. I'm sorry, that's just the way that it is. So let's go ahead and move now the other direction from a percent to a fraction. Let's look at that right now. So now we're going to be going the other direction. We're going to be converting any percent to a decimal and a fraction. So this time we've got our percent. It's 8%. It's just one that I chose because I like the way that it sounded. And we're going to be taking it to a decimal and a fraction. So to move it to a decimal, remember when we had to go the other way, we multiplied by 100. So this time we're going to be dividing the percent by 100. But again, there is a nice little secret or a nice little trick to help us do this. This means that we can move the decimal 2 spaces to the left. And if we do that, we'll get our percent to a decimal without having to do any multiplying, any dividing, any kind of math of any kind. So let's go ahead and do that now. So I'm going to write out my percent as 8%. And I know my decimal is over here on the right because I don't see it in front of the number. I'm going to be moving my decimal now 2 places to the left. So I'm going to go 1, 2, as it says. And then I'm going to be putting the decimal here in my new location, and I'm going to be filling in that space with a 0. So I know now that my decimal is 0.08. So that gave me my decimal, and now I can take my decimal and make it a fraction. Now luckily, when going with this direction, there is no long division to do. So the only thing that requires long division is to take a fraction to a decimal. So when I go from a decimal to a fraction, I'm going to use place value to rewrite the decimal as a fraction. And as always, anytime that I'm writing fractions, I need to simplify if needed. So if my fraction turns out to not be in simplest form, then I need to make sure that I go ahead and put it in simplest form. So let's go ahead and do that now. I've got 8 in the hundredths place, so I'm going to write my fraction as 8 hundredths because the 8 is in the hundredths place in my decimal. Now, 8 100ths can be simplified, so I'm going to need to simplify it because 8 and 100 are both even numbers. So if I know they're both even numbers, I know they can be reduced by at least 2. They can probably be reduced by more, but I'm going to know for a fact that if they're even, they can be reduced by 2. I know they can both be reduced by 4, so I'm going to do that now. I'm going to divide the top by 4 and the bottom by 4. 8 divided by 4 is 2, and 100 divided by 4 is 25, so I get 2/25, and that is in simplest form. So I'm going to go ahead and put a box around that because I know that is my fraction in simplest form. Now, if you didn't know to divide by 4, you could divide by 2 once, and you would have gotten 4/50, and then divide by 2 again to get 2 out of 25. So you don't have to know the largest number that it can be simplified by. You just have to keep simplifying until you can't simplify anymore. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next one. Here we are at example A, and example A gives us the fraction 8/5. So we have an improper fraction that we're going to be moving from a decimal to a percent, or to a decimal and to a percent. So now I've got 8/5, so I know to go to the decimal, unfortunately, the only way to do that is through long division. So let's just get it over with because I know that we're not going to like it, but we're going to have to do it. So in this case, I'm going to be dividing the denominator into the numerator. So I'm going to have my 5 on the outside and my 8 on the inside. So 5 does go into 8. It goes in there one time. So 1 times 5 is 5. 5 minus 8 is 3. And I can't put 5 in a 3, so I'm going to need to put down a 0 and a decimal point to get me 30. 5 does go into 30, though, evenly 6 times. 6 times 5 is 30, and that's going to give me 0. So I know that my decimal is 1.6. Now I need to go to my percent. So I'm going to be moving my decimal 2 places to the right, or I can multiply by 100. Multiplying by 100 is the mathematical way to do it. That will work if you can't remember the little trick. But we're going to use the little trick of moving our decimal 2 places to the right. So 1, 2. And I'm going to put my decimal here and fill in the 0 that we're missing. So now we know that our percent is 160%. But how can we have more than 100% of something? Well, if you take something and you double it, then you know you're getting that thing, which would be 100% of that, and double it would be 200% of that. You would be getting 2 of those things. So you can have over 100% in certain situations. So it's good to know that when we have improper fractions that we are going to have percents that are over 100%. Let's take a look at example B. So here we are at example B, and they've given us a percentage that has a decimal in it. Now, this is important to know. We don't have a decimal. Yes, we have a decimal, but not a true decimal. We have a decimal within our percent. So we need to take our percent and make it a decimal and make it a fraction. I know that it already has a decimal in it, but that does not make it a decimal. It is still a percent that happens to have a decimal in it. Okay, so now we need to move that percent to a decimal. To do that, we can either divide by 100 or we can remember our little trick. So I'm going to remember our trick, write down our 12.5%. We're going to move our decimal place 2 places to the left, 1, 2. And that's going to give me a decimal right there. So I know our decimal now is 0.125. Now we're going ahead and make that a fraction. So to do that, we're going to take the place value. So I didn't see that the 5 is in the thousandths place. So to make my fraction, I'm going to have 125 thousandths. But that is not a fraction in simplest form. I'm going to need to reduce. Now, you can reduce by several things here. I notice that I have a 5 and a 0, so both could be divisible by 5. If I can't think of any larger number that they could be divided by, I know that 5 will work, and I will just have to divide a whole bunch of times. Now, I know that I could divide both the top and the bottom by 125, and it will work out evenly, so that's what I'm going to do. So divide both the top and the bottom by 125. 125 goes into 125 one time, and 1,000 divided by 125 is 8. So my fraction is going to be 1/8. Now again, if you didn't know that you could divide by 125, that's completely understandable. You just have to pick a smaller number to divide by and keep going until you get it simplified. I know that's not the easiest thing to do, but it's better than getting the question wrong. Let's take a look at example C. Here we are in example C, and it says, using this number line, we're going to place 5/8 and 3/8 on this number line below. So I'm looking at my number line and I see that it's marked with fourths, which is not super helpful because they gave us numbers that are eighths, but it's actually not that bad. So let's take a look at our number line, and actually we need to figure out what our number line is broken into before we can figure out what our fractions go. Now, there is a way where we don't have to count things on a number line and try and figure out where fractions match other fractions. We could just turn everything into a decimal, and that will tell us where the things are on our number line. We could totally do that. And we may know that 1/2 is equal to 0.5. We may know that off the top of our head. And we may also know that 1/4 is equal to 0.25, and that 3/4 is equal to 0.75. Those are what we call common conversions. They are ones that you're going to want to have memorized because you don't want to constantly be dividing 1 divided by 4 and doing 3 divided by 4 long division and 1/2 long division. It's probably a really good idea to memorize those common conversions so that you don't have to continue to do long division over and over again. So we may know that these are our decimals. So we could do the long division for 5/8 and 3/8. So let's go ahead and do that now. We're going to convert everything into a decimal and see where it ends up on our number line. And then we'll see if there was a faster way for us to do this. So I'm going to start with 5/8. So I know that I'm going to be dividing 8 into 5. 8 doesn't go into 5 evenly, so I'm going to be putting a 0 and I'm going to be putting a decimal. So I'm going to need to bring down another 0. 8 does go into 50 6 times. So 6 times 8 is 48. So I'm going to write that down. Do my subtraction. That gives me 2. 2 doesn't go into 8, or 8 doesn't go into 2. So I'm going to need another 0. 8 does go into 20. It goes in there 2 times. So 2 times 8 is 16. I end up with 4. Need another 0. Bring down my 0. 8 does go into 45 times. So I know that that is going to be 0.625. So I can take a look at my number line, try and figure out where 6.25 is. I know it's going to be between the 1/2 and the 3/4, but I'm not exactly sure where. But let's go ahead and do the 3/8 now that we can figure out where that one is. So again, I'm going to take my 8 and divide it into 3. I know it doesn't go into 3 evenly, so I'll put my 0, put my decimal point. I'm going to take 8, need another 0. 8 does go into 30. Three times. 8 times 3 is 24. Bring down my 6. 8 doesn't go into 6, so I'm going to need another 0. 8 does go into 67 times. 8 times 7 is 56. Bring down my 4. I need another 0. And 8 does go into 45 times, as we did in our last problem, and I've got 0.375. So I know that is right between 0.25 and right between 0.75 for the 6.25. So I can put those on my number line now. I know that this is right between 0.25 and 0.5. So I know that's where 3/8 is going to go. And I'm going to write it in original form. I'm not going to write it into the decimal I turned it into. And the 5/8 goes right here between 0.5 and 0.75. Now that was a lot of work. And there's actually a faster way to do this. So I was looking for eighths. Let's see what my number line was broken into by counting the spaces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So my number line was actually broken into eighths. So I could have known that this was 1/8. 1/4 is 2/8 simplified. This is 3/8, and that's where we put it at. 1/2 is 4/8, so that would have been simplified to 1/2. Then I know I've got 5/8. 6/8 is simplified down to 3/4, and 7/8 here on the end. So I could have just counted the spaces on my number line to see where these went rather than doing long division. Long division will work. It just takes a lot of time. And sometimes there's a faster way to do things. So we need to make sure that we're using all of our brain power to determine what is the easiest way to solve the problem, not necessarily which way is the way that I've just been told to do it one time only the right way. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next one. Here we are at practice number 1. It says place 7/10 and 3/10 on this number line. So this one you're going to try on your own. Now, I did show you how long division can work, and you could use that way. But there also is probably another method that you might want to use. So I want you to go ahead and pause the video now, try the practice problem on your own, then press play again to see if you are right. How did you do? Were you able to place both 7/10 and 3/10 on the number line correctly? Notice that I counted the number line spaces, realized that it was broken into tenths, and then I didn't bother with the long division. I just put the 3/10 at the 3/10 and the 7/10 at the 7/10. Again, if you did long division, that will work. There's nothing wrong with that, but you still have to know how many things are on each number line to know where to put your numbers when you're done. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next one. So here we are at example D, and it says, what is the value of x as a fraction and as a decimal and as a percent, and what is the value of y as a fraction, a decimal, and percent? Well, good news, I've got my number line, and I have no numbers on there other than 0 and 1. So I'm going to have to count to see what my number line is broken into, and then hopefully that'll tell me where x and y are. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I've got 10 spaces. Remember, when working with number lines, it's very, very important to count the spaces, not the lines, to determine how many times the number line is broken up. Count the spaces, not the lines. So in this case, I have 10 spaces so that I know my number line is broken into tenths. So I can go ahead and label that. I've got 1/10, 2/10, and you could break that down into 3 to 1/5 if you want. But for this case, we're going to leave it as tenths just so we know where it is. Then I've got 3/10, 4/10, 5/10, which again is a half, 6/10, 7/10, 8/10, 9/10, and then 1, which would be 10/10, obviously. So since I've got x at 2/10, I know that reduces down to 1/5. So I'm going to have 1/5 1/5 is my fraction, so I'm going to go ahead and drag that over there. And then I go y is 9/10. 9/10 cannot be reduced, so that's my fraction there. So I've got them labeled up. So I'm going to say x is 1/5 and y is 9/10. Now I need to put them as decimals. Now it's important to know that 2/10 was my decimal for x, so 2/10, I'm going to write that out as 0.2 or 2/10. Same thing for my value of y. I've got 9/10, so I'm going to write that out as 9/10 or 0.9. Now I need them as percents, and I'm going to move my decimal 2 places to the right for that. So I've got my 2/10. I'm going to write down my 0.2. I'm going to move it 2 spaces to the right, and that's going to give me a 0 there, so I know that one's going to be 20%. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the 9/10, so I'm going to have my 0.9. I'm going to move my decimal 2 places to the right, 1, 2, and that's going to give me 90% there. All right, let's move on to the next one. So here we are at the last one, example E, and it's giving me 3 pictures of shaded regions. It says the value of the shaded region as a fraction in simplest form, as a decimal, and as a percent. So we're going to take these 3 pictures, and we're going to be putting them in fraction, decimal, and percent. So I'm going to start with the first one on the left, and I've got a 10 by 10 grid. So I know if I have a 10 by 10 grid, or 10 times 10 is 100, I know that whatever this is going to be is out of 100. So then I can count the shaded squares. Now it's a lot easier than that because I know that each row of these are 10. So I could say right here for the first row, I could say this is 10, 20, 30, and then I just need to count the ones that I have left. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I know that I have 36 out of 100 have been covered, so I'm going to bring in my 36 out of 100. Now I know that's not a fraction in simplest form, so I need to reduce it. So I'm going to reduce it to 9/25, dividing both the top and the bottom by 4. And I know now that I have a fraction in simplest form because I divided both the top and the bottom by 4. So we're going to hold on to making that a decimal for one moment, and we're going to go to our next shaded region picture. And it looks like I have a circle, and some of the circle is covered. So let's count how many spaces of the circle we have. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I have 5 spaces in my circle, and 2 of them are shaded. So I know my fraction is going to be 2/5. Going on to the last box there on the end, again, I've got rows. It doesn't tell me how many rows, so I'm going to have to count across 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I'm going to count down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I know I have a 6 by 5, and 6 times 5 is 30. So I know I have 30 squares. So now I have to figure out how many of them are shaded. So to do that, I'm going to count the 2 rows that I have. So I know these are 6 each. So 6 plus 6 is 12. Then 13, 14, 15. So I know that I have 15 out of my shaded square, 15 out of my shaded squares of 30 are shaded, or 15/30. And I know that reduces to being 1/2 because half of 30 is 15. So now I'm going to take my fractions and make them decimals. And the only way to do that is long division. For some of them, 9/25 is probably one we're going to have to do long division from. Hopefully I can figure out the fifths and the halves by using that trick that I had at the very, very, very beginning of the notes, where I multiplied everything to 100, and that was able to get me where I needed to go. So for the first one, I actually probably don't even need to do long division there either, because I've got 36 100ths. So I know that my decimal is going to be 36 hundredths. How would I get from 2/5 to 100? Well, I know 5 times 20 is 100, so I could do 2 times 20, and if I did that, I would get 40, so I know I have 40 hundredths. Now I know I have 1/2. Hopefully I'm getting that one memorized because it is a common conversion, so it's very important to have that one memorized, and I know that's going to be 0.5. So now I'm going to move them percents, and I can just move my decimal 2 places to the right, so I'm going to go ahead and do that in the first one, 1, 2, and if I do that, I end up with 36%. I'm going to do that for the second one as well. There's no 0 here, but I know when I move my decimal, I'm going to place a 0 there, and that's going to be 40%. And then my last one, 0.5. Hopefully I know what half is and 50%, and I don't need to move my decimal, but if you do, go ahead. But hopefully you've got it memorized. This brings us to the end of this set of notes. So if you like this video, go ahead and smack that like button. If you love this video, go ahead and throw us a sub, and we will see you in the next one.